It's coming soon. The age of the cyborg. Living beings that combine biology and technology. Already we can make animals do what we want them to. And humans can control computers by thought alone. The potential may be limitless. Cyborgs could download and process huge amounts of information effortlessly. Is the merging of man and machine, the cyborg, the future of humanity? Technology used to be an aid to do things better or to make up for our own shortcomings. We used it. By the end of the 20th century, it was all around us and sometimes inside us. Once, technology and human evolution went hand in hand. Now, it seems to be overtaking us. Will man and machine merge? Professor Kevin Warwick is trying this out on himself. He's had a tiny radio transmitter implanted into his body. He wants to become the world's first cyborg. For 90 days, the transmitter was linked to his university's computer network.
Hello, Professor Warwick.
Hello.
The computer could track him anywhere in Reading University's cybernetics lab. Warwick's day job is to develop robots, soulless creatures that only do as much as their information input allows. But Kevin Warwick has now gone one further. He has a microchip implanted in his arm which is directly connected to his nervous system. 100 electrodes on the chip are plugged into the main nerve on his wrist. This is the nerve that carries electrical impulses from his brain to his fingers. The implant picks up and measures these impulses. The signals that move his hand can be transmitted to control many other devices. For instance, he can make his wheelchair move.
And that's backwards. And that's left. And right.
For Professor Warwick, the merging of man and machine is not only possible and desirable, but inevitable. We can't make robots human, but we can make them part of us. For him, it's the only way to advance artificial intelligence and to keep it under our control. But soon we'll be following the computers.
The possibility is there of not necessarily us suffering from an intelligent machine-dominated world, but for us to upgrade, to have implants to link our brains to the intellectual capabilities of the machine, to become part machine ourselves, to become cyborgs, part human, part machine. So rather than to be beaten by intelligent machines, we become one with them. If you can't beat them, join them.
But Kevin Warwick's vision requires a seamless link between the nervous system and electronic devices. That link is known as a neurochip. Neuroscientist Peter Fromherz of the Max Planck Institute is one of the leading researchers in the field. He's working hard to find out what it takes to link nerve cells to computer circuits. Or if it's even possible. Because there's a huge hurdle to overcome.
Computer bestehen aus vielen Schaltern.
Computers are made of lots of switches and transistors. They calculate. They add zeros and ones and ones and ones, but it's a sequential set of calculations. We don't know how the brain functions, but it certainly doesn't calculate. That's not possible because the component parts of the brain, the ion canals, the ions in the cells, are at least 1,000,000 times slower than the components of a computer, and you couldn't build a computer with such slow components. It wouldn't work. So the brain must function in a different way. It is some kind of parallel dynamic that we don't yet understand.
How realistic is the vision of a cyborg with a neurochip implanted in his brain? It's the latest stage in a long scientific saga. It all started with Luigi Volta in 1787. With the very first batteries, he delivered an electric shock to frogs' legs. It made their muscles contract. We still use this same phenomenon to contract muscles and save lives. And now we know too that the language of our brains is based on bioelectric impulses. Millions of nerve cells communicate in fractions of a second, and we each have 100 billion active nerve cells in our brains. Stretch them out, and they'd reach from the Earth to the Moon, a distance of 300,000 kilometers. No wonder there are still a few mysteries to be solved. And the brain on its own is powerless. In order to be aware of its surroundings, it needs highly specialized inputs of electrical information. It needs to be linked to our senses to supply that information. Our hearing is the receptor we know best. It's our ears, even more than our eyes, that help us locate ourselves in our environment. But what happens if we lose that source of information? Could a neurochip replace our inner ear, or even improve on its performance? Scientists are already halfway there. This is an inner ear implant. Here at the Hanover Medical School, the experts restore the hearing of 250 people every year. Our sense of hearing is a very sophisticated system. Our ears consist of three parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer ear receives the sound waves and channels them to the eardrum in the middle ear. The waves make the eardrum vibrate, and the hairs in the spiral of the inner ear turn those vibrations into electrical currents. Nerves carry the impulses to the brain, where hearing happens. millions of people across the world suffer 100% deafness, not just caused by noise. They may have been born deaf, or their deafness could be the result of illness or the side effects of medicines. The first stage of every treatment is to find out what the patient can hear and to test their balance. The hairs of the inner ear react to the slightest divergence from the vertical. The implant operation is achieving remarkable results. 80% of children with an implant go on to attend normal schools. Children that are born deaf receive 2 implants, because the parts of the brain that process hearing need intensive and early stimulation to learn to understand the sounds. The only sound messages their brains have ever received come from the implants. Adults aren't quite so lucky. If they were born deaf, it may be too late to educate their brains. And if they lost their hearing, the new sounds are very different from what they were used to. The positioning of the implant is critical. It's a delicate and invasive operation. But it's essential if the brain is to learn to hear. Now, this is well-established technology. High-tech spare parts are a familiar part of modern medicine. This new hearing system comes in 2 parts: the internal cochlear implant and an external speech processor. A tiny microphone picks up the sounds for the speech processor. This transforms them into signals and sends them to the transmitter. The transmitter sends the signals to the individual receivers on the implant itself. The electrodes on the implant then stimulate nerve fibers in the spiral of the inner ear, and hearing takes place. Four weeks after the operation, a technician tunes in the device.
I'm going to test to see if it's all working.
First, the doctors check that the 22 electrodes are working properly.
Now you can hear very soft sounds. Or maybe you can't hear them at all, and I'll make them a little louder. If you hear something, let me know.
Then the patient must train their brain how to hear with the implant.
Quiet?
Very quiet. Now it's pleasant.
Pleasant. And can you understand anything yet?
A little, yet.
That's great.
They've been developing this system for more than 30 years. The quality has steadily improved. But this is still just an implant. The 22 electrodes are placed next to the cells of the inner ear, but there's no permanent contact between them. The researchers in Hanover are aiming for the next step, a real neurochip, the merging of man and machine. They lay thin layers of human nerve cells in a nutrient solution. The idea is they'll grow around the electrodes and form permanent connections. If they succeed in joining them up, they will have a genuine neurochip. Already, the results are astonishing.
Did you hear something? Something loud? And what was it? That's right, it was the drum. Very good.
But super hearing is still a long way away. And that's even truer of experiments with artificial vision. Our eyes supply us with enormous amounts of detailed information. It's a far steeper slope for technology to climb. Sherry Brown is blind. When she was 16, her optic nerve was destroyed in a car crash.
Weeks ago she had her accident. We've been through so much.
She'd almost given up hope of ever seeing again when she heard of a process known as the artificial vision system. She's one of only 16 people in the world who've received this treatment.
You get it at the right place, it clicks right in. So you got little grooves in here, and you got to make sure they go in the right spot. Otherwise, you can't fasten it down.
It's now several months since Sherry had 2 electrodes implanted on the surface of her brain. The artificial vision system is beginning to help her see again. Dr. Galanis was Sherry's specialist. When he realized he couldn't help her, he found out about this operation. Now she's come back to show him the results.
Her coordinator, you're the Cardinal twins first.
Yeah, I think red is all we had, but we've got other.
Unlike the cochlear implant, in this case, the surface of the brain is directly stimulated.
And you've been using it like an hour a day.
An hour a day, yeah. She knows she's got
The camera in her spectacles sends digital signals to the computer around her waist.
What we have to do is
A cable then carries the signals to the implant in the sight centers of Sherry's brain, where she sees.
not yet. There, it just popped on. Whoa.
Whoa.
Just walk behind.
That was, yeah.
Oh, whoa.
You have some bright lights, Doctor. Check you out.
I got a white coat on. So that's probably what's
so cool.
That's probably what's
oh my goodness.
Of course I got a white shirt.
Sherry practices every day to help her brain get used to the system.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So what?
Oh, is that you, Chris?
Because this is a very different way of seeing.
One of the pieces of Dr. Galanis' equipment there.
Right there?
Yeah, I got to roll back a little bit more. There.
Best way I can think of to describe it is if someone's taking a picture of you that has a camera flash on it, and you know how sometimes a flash will get you in the eye, and then you just kind of see a resonance of it for a little bit, like a little white dot. That's how I see, but I see two white dots, one on top of the other.
The electrodes are connected to the sight centers in both lobes of the brain. The electric signals stimulate the brain to see points of light that settle into shapes. The only American surgeon who has implanted the artificial vision system is Dr. Kenneth Smith.
Well, it's better to see you.
Come on down to my office.
The operation isn't allowed in the US, so Dr. Smith has to go to Portugal to carry it out. He regularly checks the electrodes in Sherry's head because the direct connection to the brain means there's a constant risk of infection.
That's why I have this all.
Hi, Sherry.
Roger!
How you doing, good looking?
Roger Evans comes by to check Sherry's progress.
Who turned you on this morning?
I had to turn myself on.
Oh.
The operation cost $100,000. The local Lions Club paid for it.
Because sometimes my dots are not just white, but they'll be a little red inside. Cool.
Okay, can you
Whoa.
focus? That was Dr. Smith. You can focus on the table.
Follow-up checks are a vital part of the treatment and of the research.
And the objects are...
She found the book.
I got it.
Fun.
I got it.
What did you think that was?
Sherry can already see
Maybe it was gonna
outlines
be,
against a contrasting background.
A telephone, maybe. The way the dots
maybe.
acted.
Okay.
Because sometimes a telephone will
Well,
really
look around.
reflect.
There is something there that looks a little like a telephone.
The grain.
Now I'm seeing some flashes right
It's
here.
the difference in the grain, yeah.
Oh.
This is how it might look one day when the system works perfectly.
But there's two small objects still on the table.
There's always a few seconds delay before an image forms itself in the brain.
I'm seeing something. Stapler!
Once again, a computer can't seem to equal the speed of the brain. Normal human sight works completely differently. The retina transforms light waves into bioelectric impulses, which the optic nerve carries to the sight centers at the back of the brain. It's the brain that sees and then recognizes what we see. The first job is to make a shape. Separate outlines are assembled until a tower is recognized. But this could be any tower anywhere. Next, the brain processes information about color. Step by step, the brain combines different kinds of information into one image, one impression. The brain combines memories and knowledge with fresh input. Once the Eiffel Tower is recognized, the person feels a surge of recognition, as further associations with the image are instantly added. Only then is the picture complete. By these standards, Sherry's restored vision is crude. But every success counts.
Some flashes here.
Her brain takes a few seconds to form shapes from the camera's data. In this case, a chair.
Is that one edge of it there? Mm-hmm. Really? Mm-hmm. And there's the edge of it again, right?
Mm-hmm. Can you walk to it?
Let me see. You're kidding me.
No. You got it.
I did it. After the surgery, I had too much brain leakage, and they had to do another surgery to patch that up. Then I had an infection. So I've kind of been put through the ringer. But when I finally got turned on and I could see lights, oh, it was all worth it. Definitely all worth it.
Sherry wants to improve her sight still further. But expensive software is needed to activate a higher number of electrodes in her brain. She may have to wait a while.
You got it all the way to the fountain again.
Computer-aided super eyes are still some way away. Back in the 1960s, the Pentagon experimented with electrical stimulation of the brain to force animals to do things or to stop them. Scientists anesthetized a bull and implanted electrodes into its brain. They sent radio signals to the bull's brain to control it. Using a remote control device, they could stop the bull from attacking. In fact, all they were doing was immobilizing it. But the CIA believed they could operate animals by remote control, and even do the same with people. Today, American scientists implant electrodes into rats and give them instructions by computer. They hope to use the animals in future to clear mines or find people trapped in collapsed buildings. Of course, a robo-rat would always do exactly what its operator told it to, even if that ran counter to its own instincts. And that's why neuroethics commissions all over the world are worried this technology could be misused. Scientists in Florida have experimented with rat brain cells cultivated on microchips. They were connected to the flight simulator of an F-22 jet fighter. Apparently, they could be used to keep the plane straight and level, and even guide it through a storm. The scientists don't claim any practical application for their experiment. But some fear that real soldiers could one day be manipulated in the same way. If you want to influence someone's actions in detail, you need to know exactly what the impulses look like that cause them. Here, the sensors are picking up and displaying some of the millions of signals generated in a volunteer's brain when he thinks about a movement. An American corporation is using similar research to go a step further. In a world first, they have inserted a chip into a human brain to pick up signals from carefully selected areas. The BrainGate system will allow disabled people to control a computer with the power of thought alone. A sensor smaller than a contact lens is inserted into the motor center of the brain. The sensor picks up electrical signals and sends them to a computer that processes the data. The effect is remarkable. The patient moves a cursor across the screen by thought alone. He can use it to control all the machines around him. Matthew Nagel is the first quadriplegic patient to receive the implant.
Going to open the first email, which says congrats. It says you are doing a great job. Next, I'm going to open the second email there. It says, hi, we'll talk soon. Now I'm going to the exit. Next, I'm going to paint a circle. That's the best circle I can do. Now I'm going to exit. Next, I'm going to turn on my television. I'm going to hit power button to turn the television on. The television is on. I'm going to channel down. There's channel down. Now I'm going to channel up. The
Matthew's chip processes 10 million bits of data per second. Abe Kaplan is one of the system's programmers.
So here we have all the neural signals that are being recorded from the sensor in the brain. Each box represents the neural activity that's being recorded from one of the electrodes on the tip of the array. So we have 96 recording electrodes on the sensor, and here we're seeing the signal coming from each one.
So
Professor John Donoghue and his team have worked for 10 years to get this far.
Cut as when we saw, but you know, we just chose left, right, but it could have been up.
And neurons, anything as clear as that, really?
Yeah, really good. Yeah.
And Donoghue has high ambitions for the future.
Once we understand those control parameters, the idea is not just to be able to plug into a computer, but to reconstitute the body. And the idea is that in a paralyzed individual, their muscles are there, they just can't contract them. So you can imagine a system that takes these signals and physically brings them down to the paralyzed muscles and then connects to a stimulator that underneath the skin and embedded in the muscles will stimulate the muscles and get the arm to move. And the goal would be someday, and I think this is a realizable goal, is that a person would be sitting here and pointing and moving around with their hand and say, oh, by the way, you know, I had a spinal cord injury, the nerves were cut, and I'm repaired, but you can't tell. And that would be a success. We would be very happy to see that you couldn't tell whether they had a physical nervous system or a biological nervous system. But you know, that's a very ambitious goal. It's going to take quite a long time to do that.
The BrainGate system is good at doing one thing at a time. The current implant can't manage a complex movement like this. But it can tell an artificial hand to grip an object.
Now close it.
Now close. Open.
Some fear that interpreting brain patterns that lead to a movement means we're on the way to reading people's thoughts.
In a circle.
But Professor Donoghue believes that's still a long way off.
In terms of the ethical implications of BrainGate, we're sensing your intention to move, and we're sensing a little snippet, a tiny piece of the brain's own very elaborate process to produce what, you know, the action you want to produce. There are those that may have some concerns about reading out the brain, but really our thoughts are the result of the interaction of a huge amount of the brain, and we have only the crudest way to read out, you know, all these interactions. So I think these strong concerns that very few people have expressed about, you know, reading out too much about your thoughts is really not a big concern. But I think it's important to keep it in the public dialogue so that people are aware and educated about what this technology does, what it promises, and what it can't do. It can't read your mind about what you're going to do tomorrow or your deepest thoughts.
So are we still a long way from becoming superhuman? One person can influence another directly with neuroimplants, especially if you keep it in the family. Back in Reading, Professor Kevin Warwick's wife has had 2 electrodes implanted in her wrists. Using his and hers electrodes, when he moves his arm, she feels a tingling in the same muscles. And now, Kevin Warwick is advancing boldly to his ultimate project.
Cyborg 4.0 is the most exciting part of the research. I have to say it's looking 9-10 years out, and it will involve my next implantation. I believe firmly that thought communication is quite possible. I can see how to bring it about telegraphically, and that's what I want to do in my lifetime. So it will involve a neural implant in my brain, possibly more than one implant, to allow me to communicate with another implanted individual just by thoughts.
Will telepathy make communication easier? Maybe we'll all have separate wavelengths and dial a person's number just by thinking of them. And for thought transfer, we will need the ultimate neurochip, a perfect dialogue of electrodes and brain cells, transmitting and receiving information in the same dynamic way as our brains. Professor Peter Fromherz at the Max Planck Institute in Munich is a pioneer in the development of neurochips. He's been working for more than 20 years to combine nerve cells and microchips. But is it really possible to connect organic matter to a piece of silicon?
Computers depend on the movement of electrons in solid channels of silicon. The brain also depends on the movement of electrical particles, but these are ions, potassium chloride ions in water. The electrons can't move across into the water, and the ions can't cross into the silicon. So at first sight, it looks as though no current is possible, and therefore no connections between the two. So you don't try to run a current from the chip to the cell or from the cell to the chip, but you bring the cell so close to the chip that the cell senses the electrical field, the tension in the chip, and the chip senses the electrical tension in the cell.
The latest generation of neurochips is finally making that possible. And snails are blazing the trail. Or at least their brain cells are. Snail cells are useful because they're bigger than mammal cells, and because they produce a more powerful electrical signal. Snail cells are useful too because just a few of them can control important bodily functions. 3 nerve cells control a snail's respiration. Removing the cells is delicate work. The snail is anesthetized and its brain is carefully removed. Then individual brain cells are extracted. The cells are placed on a 128 transistor chip. After a few weeks in a nutrient, they have built up countless connections. A single brain cell can connect with as many as 10,000 others. The chip can now listen in to the communications between cells. But 128 transistors can't capture information exchanged by thousands of cells. Fromherz started work with a chip that had just 8 transistors. The latest generation of neurochips measure 1 square millimeter and have 16,400 transistors. Each one of these tiny transistors can pick up 2,000 signals every second. That's more than 52 million signals. The team can use these new chips to work with mammal cells. Now they hope to pick up much more complex signals. When the nerve cells on the chip are electrically stimulated, the communication between them can be observed and measured. If enough cells can be observed simultaneously, we may at last begin to understand how different parts of the brain function. This animation shows 25,000 rat brain cells communicating in 14,000th of a second. It's as if we were watching a rat think. The blink of an eye involves the simultaneous stimulation of millions of brain cells. In fractions of a second, signals are exchanged with many different parts of the brain. It's a reminder how difficult it is to understand the network of the brain, especially the human brain. So can neurochips enhance our brains, or even replace parts of them?
Meine Ansicht ist, dass wir
I believe we have far too little data,
Daten haben, viel zu
far too little knowledge. Even if we're not talking about the whole brain, but just one area, the visual cortex, the retina, or the hippocampus, each of these has millions of cells and billions of synapses. We all believe that the interaction of these cells and the synapses creates the brain function, but we still have no way to observe millions of nerve cells. We could monitor 2 neurons, or 20, or 100, but never millions. And I don't think it's possible to decode the brain if we can't observe the dynamics of millions of cells at the same time. That means, if our technology continues in the same way, we can't expect the answer in the next 20 years.
For Professor Fromherz, the human brain remains the most complex structure on Earth. The most advanced computers today can't even simulate the nervous system of a fly. We already have plenty of ways of influencing living creatures with electronic signals. But communicating with the inner universe of the brain remains one of the great challenges of the future. Will the cyborg ever have his day?